Each year, naval historians and military archaeologists uncover remnants of World War II's most secretive operations, revealing that approximately 784 German U-boats were deployed during the war, with over 630 of them lost to the depths of the Atlantic, Arctic, and beyond, taking with them roughly 28,000 Kriegsmarine submariners who would never return home. It happens so frequently that specialized departments within NATO Naval Intelligence, the German Federal Archives, and various international maritime investigation units have dedicated entire divisions to tracking, locating, and documenting these iron coffins with combined annual budgets exceeding $340 million, specifically allocated to understanding what really happened in those final desperate months of the Third Reich. The Battle of the Atlantic from 1939 to 1945 saw the most brutal submarine warfare in human history, with the cramped, freezing conditions inside these vessels created a psychological pressure cooker that drove men to the absolute limits of human endurance, and sometimes far beyond those limits into territories that military psychiatrists still struggle to categorize in official medical literature. For a brief period during the final chaotic weeks of April 1945, one particular Type I XC-40 U-boat designated U-534 would embark on a classified mission into the Arctic Circle that was so extraordinarily sensitive and terrifying that the Kriegsmarine High Command personally ordered the destruction of all related documentation, threatening execution for any sailor who spoke of the vessel's true objective. But what exactly was the cargo that U-534 carried into those frozen waters at coordinates that don't appear on any official naval charts? And why did a joint American-British recovery expedition in 1972 find the submarine's entire crew of 52 men simply gone, with only their personal effects, half-eaten meals, and a captain's log that had been methodically burned page by page, leaving only the final entry intact with 2 words scrawled in blood: "See common?" The Arctic Circle encompasses approximately 20 million square kilometers of the most inhospitable and least explored territory on Earth, where winter temperatures routinely plummet to minus 40 degrees Celsius, where the sun disappears completely for months during the polar night, and where the crushing pressure at depths exceeding 400 meters can compress a submarine's hull like an aluminum cannon of ice. The waters north of the Norwegian Sea, particularly the region between Svalbard and Franz Josef Land, where U-534 was eventually discovered, represents some of the deepest and most treacherous naval passages in existence, with underwater canyons dropping suddenly to depths of over 3,000 meters, magnetic anomalies that render compasses useless, and ice formations that can appear and disappear within hours, trapping vessels in frozen tombs with no warning whatsoever. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that this region has been associated with maritime disappearances and unexplained phenomena for centuries, long before modern submarines ever dared to venture into these lightless depths, where the boundary between the known world and something far older and far stranger has always been dangerously thin. The indigenous Sami people of northern Scandinavia, whose ancestors have inhabited these frozen lands for over 10,000 years, possess oral traditions dating back countless generations that speak of the Stalo, or Stalu, beings that dwell in the deepest parts of the ocean, where no light has ever penetrated, creatures described in their ancient joik songs as having forms that shift and change like shadows, underwater entities that were said to drag entire Viking longships beneath the ice during the medieval period, leaving only spreading pools of black water where wooden vessels had been moments before. These weren't mere superstitions or folklore created to frighten children, but detailed accounts passed down through families, with specific geographic locations marked as forbidden zones where fishing boats were never to venture, coordinates that the Sami marked, with cairns of stones along the coastline as warnings to anyone foolish enough to challenge what lived in those abyssal trenches. Most disturbing of all, Norwegian monks translating these accounts in the 13th century noted but the Sami word used to describe these entities, Hasenjalbi, literally translates to the eyes beneath the water that watch upward, and that these beings were believed to be drawn specifically to human presence, to the sounds of engines and machinery, to anything that disturbed the ancient silence of their domain. Similar encounters were reported by Allied and Axis naval forces throughout World War II, though these incidents were systematically classified and removed from official records by 1946. British Admiralty documents, declassified in 1998, revealed that between January 1943 and May 1945, no fewer than 23 Allied submarines operating in Arctic waters reported anomalous contact on their sonar systems, describing objects that moved at speeds exceeding 180 knots underwater, which is physically impossible for any known vessel or marine creature objects that would circle submarines for hours before suddenly accelerating downward into depths that no sonar could penetrate. The USS Squalus, an American submarine that mysteriously sank during Arctic trials in 1943 with all hands lost, was recovered 6 months later with its hull showing massive pressure damage inconsistent with any known depth crush pattern, and its crew compartments empty despite being sealed from the inside, with only their uniforms remaining in neat piles as if the men had simply dissolved out of their clothing. Soviet Northern Fleet archives briefly accessible during the Glasnost period of the late 1980s contained references to at least 7 submarines that went silent while patrolling the same coordinates, where U-534 would later be found vessels that never responded to radio contact again and were never recovered. Their last transmissions consisting of frantic reports about sonar contacts that defied all known physics and sounds described as like singing, but wrong like voices trying to form words in a language that makes your skull ache to hear. April 22, 1945, 0340 hours, the U-534 slipped beneath the surface of the Norwegian Sea at coordinates 74N28E, beginning what its commanding officer, Captain Lieutenant Herbert Nallau, a decorated veteran of 47 combat patrols who had personally sunk 18 Allied vessels and survived 3 depth charge attacks that should have killed him, had been told in no uncertain terms would be his final and most critical mission of the war. Nallau, known to his crew by the nickname Der Eisern, or the Iron, one due to his seemingly supernatural ability to keep his composure during the most terrifying engagements, had received sealed orders directly from Großadmiral Karl Dönitz, himself just 36 hours earlier, orders that he was instructed to open only once the submarine had descended below 200 meters and was beyond any possible radio interception by Allied forces. The mission parameters were unlike anything Nallau had encountered in his 8 years of submarine warfare. The orders specified that U-534 was to proceed at maximum depth to a precise set of coordinates in the Arctic Circle, where no German vessel had any strategic reason to be there. They were to deploy a specialized cargo contained in 3 reinforced steel containers that had been welded into the torpedo room under armed guard, containers that Nallau and his crew had been explicitly forbidden from opening or even discussing among themselves. His crew of 52 men, including his trusted executive officer, Oberleutnant Ziersee, Klaus Reinhardt, chief engineer, Oberleutnant Werner Schaefer nicknamed Der Mechaniker for his almost mystical ability to keep machinery functioning under impossible conditions, and the boat's youngest member, 19-year-old Matros Friedrich Vogel, who served as the forward torpedo room operator, had noticed something deeply unsettling about this mission from the moment those containers had been loaded aboard. They were cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, cold in a way that made men's teeth ache when they stood too close, and they emitted a low-frequency vibration that you couldn't quite hear but could feel in your bones if you pressed your hand against the bulkhead. The first anomaly occurred exactly 47 minutes after they passed the 300-meter depth mark when Funkmatt Otto Brandt, the submarine's senior radio operator who had been monitoring passive sonar for enemy destroyer activity, suddenly removed his headphones with hands that trembled so violently he nearly dropped the equipment. His face had gone the color of old snow, and when Nalau demanded to know what he'd heard, Brandt could only whisper that there was something out there, something massive moving parallel to their course, at a depth that should have been impossible for any living creature or man-made vessel. Nalau immediately ordered the hydrophone system engaged, and what the entire command crew heard through those speakers would haunt every man present for however many hours or days they had remaining. It wasn't the distinctive diesel engine growl of an enemy submarine, nor the propeller wash of surface vessels, nor even the biological sounds of whales or other marine life that submariners become intimately familiar with. Instead, it was a sound that seemed to exist at the very edge of human hearing, a resonance that felt less like it was traveling through water and more like it was vibrating through the hull itself, through the steel, through the air, inside the pressure vessel, through the bones of every man aboard. Oberleutnant Reinhardt, who had served on U-boats since 1941 and considered himself unshakable, described it later in his personal log as singing that isn't singing like someone trying to form words using machinery that was never designed for speech, like a voice composed entirely of grinding metal and shifting pressure, and underneath it all, a rhythm that seemed almost intentional, almost like it was trying to communicate something. The sound continued for exactly 7 minutes, during which time the submarine's magnetic compass began spinning wildly. The depth gauge needles fluctuated despite the boat maintaining perfectly level trim, and the interior temperature dropped from the normal 15 degrees Celsius to just above freezing, causing men's breath to fog the air inside their own vessel. Then came the moment that transformed this from an unexplained phenomenon into something far more terrifying and impossible to deny. Young Friedrich Vogel in the forward torpedo room began screaming over the internal communication system, his voice shredded with a panic that no amount of military training could contain, shouting that something was outside the hull, something was pressing against the pressure vessel from the outside, and he could see the steel beginning to flex inward. Nalau and Reinhardt rushed forward through the narrow corridor, shoving past crewmen who had frozen in place with fear, and when they entered the torpedo room, they found Vogel backed against the far bulkhead, pointing with a shaking hand at the curved steel hull where the impossible was occurring. The pressure hull, designed to withstand the crushing force of over 200 meters of seawater, was indeed flexing inward in a pattern that made no physical sense. Not the uniform compression of external pressure, but localized depressions that moved across the surface of the steel like something was running its hands along the outside of the submarine, feeling the shape of the vessel, exploring it. The depressions were roughly the size and shape of human handprints, but scaled up to something that would require hands nearly a meter across, and they appeared in sequences of 5 or 6 at a time, moving from the bow toward the stern in a deliberate pattern that suggested intelligence and curiosity. Oberleutnant Schaefer, who had joined them with a toolkit, as if conventional engineering could possibly address what they were witnessing, placed his own hand against one of the depressions and immediately jerked back as if burned, reporting that the metal was ice cold despite the ambient water temperature being several degrees above freezing, and that he could feel vibrations through the hull that seemed to pulse in the same rhythm as that terrible singing sound they'd heard moments before. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon ceased, the handprints faded, the hull returned to its normal shape, the temperature began to rise back to normal levels, and the sonar went completely silent. But what they found in the aftermath made every man aboard realize that something fundamental had changed, and that they were now being hunted by something that existed far beyond their understanding of the natural world. Friedrich Vogel's hair, which had been dark brown when they'd left port, had turned completely white, not gray or silver, but pure white, as if he'd aged 60 years in the span of 5 minutes. And when Chief Medical Officer Stabsart Heinrich Lang examined the young sailor, he discovered that, Vogel's corneas had developed a strange clouding, a milky opacity that made his eyes look almost dead, and he kept repeating in a monotone voice that they know we're here now, they know what we're carrying, and they want it back. Captain Lieutenant Nalao immediately ordered the submarine to rise to periscope depth and attempted to establish radio contact with Kriegsmarine headquarters in Kiel. Following every protocol he'd learned over 8 years of combat operations standard procedure, dictated that any encounter with unknown vessels or phenomena required immediate reporting to Naval Command. But when Funkmott Brandt tried to transmit on every available frequency, including the emergency channels, all he received in return was static punctuated by that same disturbing resonance they'd heard through the hydrophones, as if something was actively jamming their communications or worse, listening to their attempts to call for help and responding in a language that human radio equipment was never designed to receive. Nalao made the decision that would define everything that followed. He ordered Oberleutnant Reinhardt to break the seals on the mission documents that had been stored in the captain's safe, documents that were supposed to remain classified until after the cargo had been deployed, because whatever was hunting them clearly already knew what U-534 was carrying and conventional operational security seemed absurdly inadequate given their circumstances. When Reinhardt opened the waterproof document case, with trembling hands what they discovered inside transformed their understanding of the mission from a desperate final gambit of a dying regime into something far more disturbing and ancient. The orders were not written on standard Kriegsmarine letterhead, but on heavy parchment that looked centuries old, stamped with the seal of the Ahnenerbe, the SS, organization dedicated to researching the ancestral heritage of the Aryan race, and, as these documents made horrifyingly clear, investigating and weaponizing occult phenomena that existed long before human civilization. The documents, written in a mixture of German and what Nalao recognized as Old Norse runes, explained that the 3 containers in the torpedo room contained artifacts recovered from an archaeological excavation in northern Norway in 1943, specifically from an ancient Sami burial site that had been sealed beneath permafrost for an estimated 3,000 years. Artifacts that Ahnenerbe researchers had designated as Die Rufstein or the Calling Stones, objects that, according to translated Sami shamanistic texts, possessed the ability to communicate with entities that dwelled in the deepest parts of the ocean, beings that the ancient Norse had called Hafgufa, and that older pre-Viking cultures had known by names that hurt to pronounce. The mission order specified that U-534 was to transport these artifacts to coordinates in the Arctic Circle that matched locations described in fragments of the 13th century Icelandic text Konungs Skuggsja, or the King's Mirror, a medieval manuscript that contained detailed accounts of supernatural encounters in northern waters. There, the artifacts were supposed to be deployed at a depth of exactly 400 meters as part of what the documents called Operation Nivellheim, an attempt to establish contact with these entities and negotiate some form of alliance or weapon that could turn the tide of the war in Germany's favor. But the most disturbing section of the documents was a series of handwritten notes added by Sis's Obergruppenführer, Heinrich Himmler himself, just days before U-534's departure. Notes that warned in increasingly frantic German that the artifacts had already begun waking up during transport to the submarine, that 3 researchers at the Wolfsburg Castle facility had suffered complete psychological breaks and had to be executed after attempting to destroy the containers while screaming about voices in the deep calling them home, and that under no circumstances should the containers be opened before reaching the deployment coordinates, because they are listening through the stones and they hunger for what was stolen from them. Oberleutnant Schaefer, whose engineering mindset had always preferred rational explanations over supernatural speculation, suggested they could simply jettison the containers and abort the mission. But when he and a team of 4 men attempted to access the torpedo room to begin the procedure, They discovered that the watertight door leading to the forward compartment had somehow become sealed shut, not jammed or mechanically stuck, but sealed as if the metal had fused together at the molecular level. And when Schaefer tried to cut through with an acetylene torch, the flame would not stay lit, sputtering out repeatedly as if the air itself had become hostile to fire. Then the second incident began, more violent and coordinated than the first. The singing sound returned, but this time it was coming from inside the submarine, emanating directly from the sealed containers in the torpedo room, a resonance so powerful that it made the entire pressure hull vibrate like a tuning fork. And crew members throughout the vessel began reporting that they could feel the sound in their teeth, in their skulls, in their bones, a frequency that seemed designed specifically to cause maximum psychological distress in human nervous systems. Matrose Werner Schmidt, a 23-year-old torpedo mechanic who had been stationed near the sealed door, suddenly began screaming that he could see something moving in the shadows of the corridor, shapes that didn't quite have form, darkness that moved with purpose and intention. And when other crew members rushed to assist him, they found Schmidt clawing at his own face, leaving deep bloody scratches down his cheeks as he shrieked that they're inside now. They came through the walls. They're looking for the stones. Chief Medical Officer Lang attempted to sedate Schmidt with a morphine injection, but the moment the needle pierced the sailor's skin, Schmidt's eyes rolled back to show only whites, and he spoke in a voice that was distinctly not his own, a voice that resonated with multiple tones simultaneously, a voice that formed words in archaic German mixed with sounds that predated any human language, saying, Das Gestolin muss zurückkehren, die tief verlinkt was ihr Gerd, habt die still gestört, which roughly translated to, what was stolen must return. The deep demands what belongs to it. You have disturbed the silence. The submarine systems began failing in ways that violated every principle of engineering that Schaefer had spent his career mastering. The electrical systems would surge and dim without any correlation to power draw. The air circulation pumps would reverse direction, randomly sending stale air back into compartments that desperately needed fresh oxygen. The ballast tank controls responded to commands with delays ranging from seconds to minutes, making it nearly impossible to maintain stable depth. And most disturbing of all, the navigation instruments began showing that U-534 was somehow moving through the water, faster than its engines could possibly propel it, as if something external was pulling the submarine toward those deployment coordinates, whether the crew willed it or not. Naulau made the desperate decision to order an emergency service and attempt to contact any Allied vessels in the area, reasoning that capture and imprisonment were infinitely preferable to whatever was happening in the depths. But when they attempted to blow the ballast tanks and rise, absolutely nothing happened. The compressed air system activated correctly. The valves opened as designed, but the submarine remained at depth, as if held in place by some massive force external to their control. It was Funkmacht Brandt who noticed the most terrifying detail on his sonar display. There were now multiple contacts surrounding U-534, at various depths 7 distinct objects that maintained perfect formation around the submarine, like an honor guard, or perhaps like predators circling wounded prey. Objects that matched the submarine's every course change instantaneously. Objects that, according to the sonar returns, were each roughly the size of the submarine itself, but shaped unlike any vessel or creature. Catalogued in military identification manuals, elongated and irregular with protrusions that seemed to shift and reconfigure as they moved, and all 7 of them were slowly, methodically tightening their formation, drawing closer to U-534. With each passing minute, as that terrible singing sound grew louder and louder until men began bleeding from their ears. What happened next defied every law of physics and sanity that the 52 men aboard U-534 had been taught to believe in. The 7 massive contacts on sonar that had been circling the submarine suddenly accelerated inward simultaneously, moving at speeds that should have created massive pressure waves and turbulence, but instead, produced only that singing resonance that had now become so loud that it was no longer just sound, but a physical force that made the air inside the pressure hull shimmer and distort like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Funkmouth Brant, still desperately trying to make sense of the sonar returns, began laughing hysterically as he reported that the objects weren't just approaching the submarine but were somehow merging with it. The sonar showed them interpenetrating the hull as if the steel was nothing more than water, as if the boundary between the submarine's interior and the ocean outside had become meaningless. And then Brant's laughter turned to screaming as his sonar display began showing returns from inside the submarine itself. Contacts moving through the corridors and compartments as if the vessel had been invaded by ghosts that registered on mechanical instruments. Captain Lieutenant Nullau, whose iron composure had carried him through years of depth charge attacks and surface engagements, found his hands shaking uncontrollably as he watched the temperature gauge plummet to -20 degrees Celsius, despite being hundreds of meters underwater, where such temperatures were physically impossible. Watched frost form on the interior bulkheads and spread across the steel in patterns that looked disturbingly organic, like veins or neural networks. Watched his own breath fog the air so thickly that visibility dropped to less than 2 meters in the cramped confines of the control room. The emergency lighting began to flicker and pulse in rhythm with that awful singing, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. Shadows that seemed to have depth, and substance shadows that reached toward the crew with appendages that shouldn't exist. Then the psychological assault truly began in earnest, and what remained of military discipline and rational thought collapsed under the sheer impossibility of what the crew was experiencing. Oberleutnant Reinhardt suddenly grabbed Nolau's arm with crushing force and began babbling that he could see his own death reflected in the frost patterns on the bulkhead. See, himself drowning not in water, but in something thick and black that poured into his lungs and transformed him from the inside out. See versions of himself scattered across time, experiencing the same moment of death over and over in an endless loop. Oberleutnant Schaefer, whose engineering expertise had failed utterly to explain or prevent what was happening, began systematically dismantling his own toolkit with methodical precision, explaining calmly that the tools were all wrong, that the angles weren't correct for three-dimensional space anymore, that he needed to recalibrate everything for the additional dimensions that he could suddenly perceive pressing in from directions that didn't have names in human geometry. Throughout, the submarine crew members began experiencing individual breakdowns that followed no predictable pattern. Matros Hans Kruger in the engine room reported that he could hear his mother calling to him from inside the diesel engines, could see her face forming in the moving mechanical parts, and when other sailors tried to restrain him, he fought with inhuman strength to reach the machinery, screaming that she needed him, that she'd been waiting in the deep for so long. Obermachinist Paul Fisher claimed that time had stopped flowing correctly, that he was experiencing the last 5 minutes on repeat, but slightly differently each iteration, that he'd already died 17 times in 17 slightly different ways, and each death was waiting for him, again just moments in the future. Chief Medical Officer Lang abandoned all pretense of medical rationality and began drawing complex geometric symbols on the bulkheads. Using his own blood symbols, he claimed he was seeing in the frost patterns ancient mathematical equations that described the nature of the entities surrounding them. Equations that hurt to look at because they proved that consciousness wasn't meant to exist in the way humans experienced it. The sealed torpedo room door that had fused shut suddenly burst open with an explosion of frozen air and impossible pressure differentials, and what poured out was not water or gas, but darkness itself, a tangible absence of light that moved with liquid purpose and seemed to carry within it the weight of oceanic depths and geological time, darkness that filled the forward corridor and began spreading throughout the submarine like blood through veins. And within that darkness, crew members could see things forming, shapes that approximated human form, but were composed of something that predated flesh and bone, entities that existed at the intersection of deep ocean pressure and ancient intent, beings that had been called by the stolen artifacts and had come to reclaim what had been taken from their domain. Young Friedrich Vogel, whose hair had turned white during the first encounter, emerged from that darkness, walking with a strange fluid gait as if he'd forgotten how human joints were supposed to articulate, his clouded eyes now glowing with a faint bioluminescent green that pulsed in time with the singing. And when he spoke, his voice resonated with those same multiple tones that had come from the possessed Matrose. Schmidt explaining in perfect Old Norse followed by German that the crew of U-534 had been given a choice they didn't understand. They were making, they could release the calling stones back to the deep and perhaps be allowed to return to the surface world, or they could continue trying to weaponize what should never have been disturbed and become part of the deep themselves, transformed and absorbed into something far older than the Third Reich or human civilization. Captain Lieutenant Nahlau, drawing on reserves of courage that he didn't know he still possessed, demanded to know what these entities were and what they wanted beyond the return of the artifacts. And Vogel's glowing eyes fixed on him with an expression of something that might have been pity or might have been hunger as he explained that they were the Hafgufa, the ones who had existed in the abyssal trenches since before the continents formed their current shapes, who had watched human civilizations rise and fall from the depths, who had occasionally reached upward to interact with surface dwellers when those dwellers proved interesting enough to warrant attention, and that the Ahnenerbe's researchers had made a catastrophic miscalculation in believing that these entities could be controlled or negotiated with as if they were merely another nation-state to be threatened or bargained with. The submarine's hull began to groan and shriek as massive pressure was applied from all sides simultaneously, but not the uniform crushing force of deep water pressure. Instead was localized stress points that moved and shifted as if enormous hands were gripping the vessel and testing its structural integrity, measuring how much force would be required to crack the steel and spill the contents into the surrounding ocean. The lighting failed completely except for emergency phosphorescent strips that cast everything in a sickly green glow that made it impossible to distinguish between crew members and the shadows that wore increasingly convincing approximations of human form. Sailors began reporting that they could no longer tell who was real and who was something else wearing the face of their comrades, that some of the men moving through the corridors had too many joints in their limbs or skin that rippled with patterns like deep-sea fish, that when they looked directly at certain individuals, those individuals would flicker between human form and something, elongated and adapted to crushing pressure and perfect darkness. Nahlau made the final desperate decision to use the submarine's deck gun to try to shoot one of the sealed containers, reasoning that if these entities wanted the artifacts so badly, then destroying them might provide leverage or at least revenge. But when he ordered the weapons, Walker opened every firearm inside had corroded to uselessness metal, eaten away by rust that should have taken decades to form, and the ammunition had fused into solid masses of oxidized material that crumbled to powder when touched. The 7 entities visible on sonar had now completely surrounded the submarine and were converging inward, their forms visible through the steel hull, as if the metal had become transparent, or as if the crew's perception had been altered to see things that material barriers normally blocked. And what they saw was beautiful and terrible, in equal measure beings that seemed to be composed of living water and bioluminescent flesh and something else that had no name in any human language entities that moved through 3-dimensional space while simultaneously existing in depths and pressures and dimensions that human minds simply couldn't process. And the singing that had been their signature had transformed into something that might have been words in a language that predated sound itself. The salvation came not from military intervention or human ingenuity, but from a phenomenon that the crew of U-534 could never have predicted or controlled. At precisely 0642 hours on April 23rd, a massive geomagnetic storm struck the Arctic region with an intensity that hadn't been recorded in over 2 centuries. The kind of solar event that modern scientists would later classify as an X-28 class flare, causing the aurora borealis to manifest with such violent intensity that the electromagnetic radiation penetrated hundreds of meters below the ocean's surface, flooding the depths with frequencies and energies that the ancient Hafgufa had never encountered in their millions of years of existence in the abyssal trenches. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic to the entities surrounding U-534. The singing that had been building to a reality-shattering crescendo suddenly transformed into something that could only be described as screaming, a sound of such pure agony transmitted across multiple dimensions that it caused the submarine's steel hull to vibrate like a struck bell and made what remained of the crew collapse to the deck with blood streaming from their ears and noses. The 7 massive forms visible through the increasingly transparent hull recoiled violently from the yaw, submarine as if the vessel had suddenly become toxic to them, their bioluminescent flesh flickering and dimming like dying stars, their carefully coordinated formation breaking apart into chaotic individual retreats as they fled downward into depths where the Untold Aurora's electromagnetic assault couldn't penetrate, and in their panicked departure, they released whatever metaphysical hold they'd established on U-534 systems and structure. Captain Lieutenant Nalau, barely conscious and bleeding from multiple orifices, managed to crawl to the ballast controls and execute an emergency blow that this time actually functioned. Compressed air forcing water from the tanks and sending the submarine rocketing toward the surface with such speed that several crew members were thrown against bulkheads and equipment with bone-breaking force, but none of them cared about broken ribs or concussions because they were rising, escaping, leaving the deep and whatever dwelled there behind them. U-534 breached the surface like a wounded whale. At 0651 hours, the conning tower breaking through a sheet of pack ice with sufficient force to crack the structure's external plating, and emerged into an Arctic dawn painted in colors that shouldn't exist in nature. The aurora borealis stretched across the entire sky in curtains of green and violet and crimson that pulsed and writhed as if alive, electromagnetic energies so intense that they were visible even to the naked eye as shimmering distortions in the air itself. Nalau ordered the main hatch opened and staggered onto the bridge, his first breath of surface air in over 30 hours, tasting like copper and ozone, his eyes struggling to adjust to the impossible colors dancing across the heavens. And what he saw in the water surrounding the submarine made him understand that they had not escaped cleanly or completely. The ocean surface for several hundred meters in every direction was covered with the floating corpses of deep-sea creatures that should never have been brought to the surface, species that existed only in the most extreme abyssal zones where sunlight had never penetrated, their bodies already decomposing in the unfamiliar pressure and temperature. And mixed among these alien fish were larger forms, pieces of what might have been the Hafgufa themselves, or might have been something else, entirely masses of bioluminescent tissue the size of automobiles that pulsed with dying light and emitted that same terrible singing on a frequency so low that it could be felt in the chest rather than heard. Of U-534's original complement of 52 men, only 31 remained conscious or coherent enough to respond to orders. The others were found in various states of psychological collapse, catatonic, or babbling, or in Friedrich Vogel's case simply gone, his uniform found neatly folded in the forward torpedo room beside the now open and empty containers that had held the calling stones, but no trace of the young sailor himself, except for wet footprints that led to the hull and seemed to pass through the steel as if it were water. Oberleutnant Reinhardt, whose mind had been partially shattered by visions of his own death, could only repeat coordinates over and over in a monotone voice, coordinates that when later checked corresponded to locations of other unexplained submarine disappearances throughout history, as if he'd been given a map of every place the Hafgufa had claimed victims. The rescue that arrived 6 hours later came not from German forces, but from a joint American-British task force that had been tracking U-534's unusual course through intercepted and decoded signals. 3 destroyers and a submarine tender that approached with weapons ready, expecting to capture a U-boat attempting some desperate final mission of a collapsing Third Reich, but instead finding a scene that would be immediately classified at the highest levels of military secrecy. Commander James Mitchell of the USS Bainbridge, a 28-year veteran of naval service who thought he'd seen everything the war could produce, took one look at the German submarine sitting amid a field of impossible deep-sea creatures and the surviving crew members whose eyes held the blank 1,000-yard stare of men who'd seen hell itself, and immediately radioed for specialists from naval intelligence and what would later become the precursor to the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. The German survivors were separated immediately, each man placed in isolation aboard different vessels, their personal effects confiscated, their bodies examined by doctors who documented injuries and conditions that couldn't be explained by conventional submarine operations, radiation burns that shouldn't exist from any known source, frostbite that had somehow occurred while submerged in water above freezing, and in several cases, cellular changes that suggested exposure to pressures that should have liquefied human tissue. Capitan Lieutenant Nalau, in what would be his final act of command, managed to set fire to the captain's log and most of the mission documents before being forcibly removed from U-534, watching from the deck of the Bainbridge as American sailors tried to salvage what they could from the submarine while carefully avoiding the pieces of bioluminescent tissue that still pulsed with alien life. The decision was made at the highest levels of Allied command within 18 hours. U-534 would be deliberately sunk in the deepest trench they could find, torpedoed and depth-charged until nothing remained but scattered debris. The official story would be that the submarine had been caught on the surface and destroyed in a conventional engagement, and every single man who had been present at the recovery, American, British, and German alike, would sign documents that threatened execution for any disclosure of what they'd really witnessed. But the entities that had surrounded U-534 and claimed at least 21 members of its crew had not truly departed. They had merely retreated to depths where the Aurora's assault couldn't reach. And as the wreckage of the submarine tumbled downward into the abyssal trench, where it would eventually come to rest, observers aboard the surface vessels reported seeing lights in the deep, bioluminescent glows that pulsed in patterns that seemed almost like communication, as if the Hafgufa were discussing what had just occurred, analyzing the electromagnetic weapon that had driven them back, adapting to ensure it wouldn't work a second time. The 3 calling stones that had been the cause of the entire catastrophe were never recovered. Friedrich Vogel had somehow returned them to the deep during those final moments when reality had become fluid and malleable. And according to the fragmentary testimony of the survivors, before they were permanently silenced through various means, the young sailor had done so willingly, had understood on some fundamental level that humanity had stolen something that was never meant to exist in the surface world, and that the price for keeping those artifacts would have been measured not in individual lives, but in entire cities swallowed by rising waters and phenomena that would make World War II look like a minor border skirmish. The aurora borealis that had saved U-534 survivors continued to manifest with unusual intensity for 3 more days, and during that period, every submarine operating in Arctic waters, both Allied and Axis, received orders to surface immediately and remain surfaced until the phenomenon passed orders that came without explanation, but with the weight of absolute authority, because apparently someone high enough in the chain of command understood that the deep was angry, that something ancient had been disturbed and wounded, and that provoking it further, while it was already agitated, would be catastrophically unwise. The official records were systematically falsified German Kriegsmarine documents listed U-534 has sunk on May 5, 1945 by RAF bombers in the Kattegat Strait, a story corroborated by fabricated reports and paid witnesses, while British and American files were sealed under the highest classification levels with orders not to be opened until 2045. The 31 surviving crew members were distributed across the globe and silenced through methods ranging from generous to terminal. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Nallau died from an apparent heart attack in 1952 at age 43, though a classified autopsy revealed his cardiac tissue contained microscopic structures resembling deep-sea bioluminescent organs. Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt spent 31 years in a psychiatric facility, drawing accurate maps of undiscovered ocean floor features, while repeating coordinates that corresponded to 12 submarine disappearances from 5 different nations. Oberleutnant Werner Schaefer was recruited into classified programs that became part of DARPA, claiming until his death in 1989 that he could see angles where reality bent and something watched through them. Funkmod Otto Brandt was found dead in 1947, officially suicide by drowning in an empty bathtub, his apartment walls covered with transcriptions of that singing sound in musical notation. That caused severe disorientation when reproduced. The younger survivors were given new identities and dispersed. Most died within 10 years near large bodies of water, found walking toward the ocean in trance-like states, drawn by something only they could hear. The wreckage of U-534 remained hidden until 1972, when a Norwegian-American expedition discovered it at 3,847 meters depth, finding the hull impossibly intact after 27 years, with breathable air pockets still inside, as if preserved by something that wanted it accessible. Remote cameras captured shadows moving inside despite perfect darkness, and equipment repeatedly failed when approaching the forward torpedo room, resulting in 3 lost ROVs worth $4.2 million before the expedition was terminated and the location classified. The pattern U-534 represented wasn't isolated. Classified databases contain similar encounters from every major naval power. Russian submarines with missing crews, but operational vessels Chinese. Nuclear submarines recovered with reactors running, but every sailor vanished. French boats detecting massive biological contacts, moving at impossible speeds, demonstrating coordinated hunting behavior. Earth's oceans, covering 71% of the planet and remaining 95% unexplored, apparently contain intelligences that exist outside human awareness, entities that avoid surface dwellers, but respond when we venture too deep or disturb artifacts like the calling, stones that ancient cultures from Sumerians to Norse to Pacific Islanders created to communicate with the abyssal realm's knowledge that was deliberately suppressed because contact inevitably ended in catastrophe. Today, every major naval power maintains specialized units monitoring for these entities. An ATO's Deep Water Anomaly Response, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 78, that officially doesn't exist, Russia's Oceanographic Research Directorate, all sharing information through channels that bypass normal intelligence cooperation, because the Hafgufa and whatever other intelligences share the deep represent a threat. That makes human conflicts insignificant. The survivors who lived into the 21st century all reported dreams of being called back to the water, hearing that singing in drains and pipes, seeing bioluminescent lights when they closed their eyes, and several left instructions that their ashes never be scattered at sea, because they understood that even in death, some part of them might be recognized and claimed by what waited in the depths they disturbed so long ago. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations and ignore overwhelming evidence.